wood, and that they could control my experience here. Whilst I was under the trees, I was in their control. Many more revelations I received as I gazed upon the trees about the true nature of nature itself, its power, yet also its beauty. After I had realised the true nature of the trees, the forest became like a living world of intelligence around me. It was incredible. I was amazed at what I was experiencing. I was totally lost in it. I was given a tour of all the features of the wood places that would look like ordinary forest parts to the normal eye, but to me and my woodland friends I saw cities, roads and palaces. After a time they brought me to a deep part of the woods, a dense area of pine and yew, very dark and brooding. This, I was informed, was the Dark Forest, a place of trees that had gone evil, lost their light and hated men. If I entered, I was warned I would go insane. They would take my soul and show me terrifying visions. The place oozed horror, and as I gazed in I saw some monsters lurking in the darkness. I turned away from the dark woods and headed back towards our camp. I eventually found everyone and attempted to tell them about my adventure. Most people just ignored me, telling me to shut up. No one was experiencing anything like what I was. So a little put out, I returned to my forest world. My mate, who I will call Kay, came with me, and as we walked, I described the world that I had seen. Kay started to make up his own ideas to add to the story, as if what I was experiencing I was making up, as a story. Kay was annoying me intensely by adding his ideas. He seemed like a fool who didn't realise that what I was telling him was real. So eventually I told him to piss off. He obviously was a bit put out, but then he should have realised what I was going through. Now things really started to heaten up. The forest enveloped me more than ever, but I felt that there was more to come. I came upon the dark forest again and realised that the dark woods were a gateway into the heart of this forest trip. I figured that if I could enter and pass through the dark forest, then I would discover something incredible on the other side. So I set off. As I walked, more like stumbled now, the evil forces of the dark forest tried to entice me. They tried to lock me inside their trunks. They showed me the trapped souls of men who had fallen prey to them, twisting visions in the corner of my eyes of screaming, tortured souls. I felt hands pull at my back. At one point I had an incredibly realistic hallucination of a man running up behind me with an axe, screaming as he hit me. I turned in shock and he vanished. I saw all sorts of beasts and monsters stalking on either side. Fallen trunks and old stumps became wolves and demons, chasing me deeper into the wood. This was terrifying. I felt like I was on my last legs, and at any moment would collapse and die, my soul being ripped from inside by the devilish forces around me. I came delirious upon an old twisted stump of a yew standing alone in a clearing. It became a living and twisted old hag at the centre of this dark place. It cackled at me, telling me to turn back or die, then became like 1,000 snakes and melted into the undergrowth. Despite all of this, I pressed on, determined now to find an end to this evil place. Then, as the terror of the dark forest reached a crescendo, I emerged into a light clearing, and before me was a massive old tree. An ancient face seemed to appear in its bark, and it spoke in a solemn voice that was soothing and yet all-encompassing. It certainly didn't speak in English, but in my delirium I could understand it perfectly. It explained that I had reached the heart of this trip, and that all I was experiencing was a part of my own unconscious mind. The fairies were personifications of my own character, and he, the tree, was the core of my being, the voice in my head, a voice of reason. I had been through the darkest recesses of my mind to get there, Yet my mind was vast as the forest around me, and that wherever I went from now on, I would be within my own mind, and could, if I chose to, learn more of myself the further I ventured. Everything the tree communicated made sense, and the vision of the fairies seemed to fall into place around me. I pressed on into the wood, determined to find something. By this time I was extremely fatigued. I was staggering around, talking to myself in the trees, and must have looked a right mess. The whole experience became more and more unpleasant. The woodsman seemed to have pissed off, and I kept thinking wild fairies who lived in the bushes were coming out and poking me and whispering about me behind their backs. Suddenly I found myself in a clearing. 2 huge trees had fallen down side by side. One had opened up a cave-like hole with its roots, and the other had gone the other way, its branches flailing in the air. I stared at this vision, and as I did, the cave deepened, becoming a long, infinite tunnel, and the fallen tree writhed around like the tentacles of an octopus. I almost dropped to my knees with an overwhelming sensation that I had found something meaningful. The dark cave and the octopus. What it meant I didn't know, and still don't. Yet this was it, the end, and my mind and body knew it. I suddenly had a flash of realization. I was tired, hungry and lost in the middle of the woods, without a clue where my friends were. I panicked a bit, but managed to find the edge of the forest which I left, and felt much better for it. The outside seemed far saner than the forest. After a while I bumped into my friends, and it was about 10 AM. I'd been lost in the woods for about 4 to 5 hours. They'd started to get quite worried. I smoked some hash and slumped to a half sleep as they packed up the camp. I tried to explain what I had been through, but still couldn't quite believe it myself. Was it me, or was it the drugs? Had I just had an eye-opening revelation into the true nature of the forest? Or was I suffering classic speed-induced psychosis? I needed a psychiatrist, or better still, a witch doctor to talk to. Upon returning home, I slept for about 24 hours. Long after my experience, I read about shamanism and similar cultural phenomenon, and discovered that such trance experiences are not uncommon after long periods of sleep deprivation or starvation. Was what I experienced something similar, but in an English forest setting? Maybe were we living in a society that understood such altered states of consciousness, I could have shared my experiences and maybe made sense of them as an initiation, or whatever they could be interpreted as. Unfortunately, we lack the experts, and so my story remains just that, a story.